Flight 739. In March 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, vanished without a trace over the Pacific Ocean. The plane was on a military mission during the early days of the Vietnam War, carrying 93 U.S. Army soldiers and 11 crew members. The plane departed from Guam and was en route to Saigon when, without a single distress call, it disappeared somewhere between Guam and the Philippines, leaving behind nothing but questions. Now, despite one of the largest search efforts of its time, covering more than 200,000 square miles, no evidence was ever found. Adding to the mystery, crew of nearby Liberian tanker reported seeing a mid-air explosion, yet no wreckage was found. Was it a sabotage, a tragic accident, or something else? To this day, no one knows. Flying Tiger Airlines later released a statement saying that the aircraft was either sabotaged or the plane, along with its crew, could have been kidnapped. Yet, they didn't have any evidence to back their claims. And even 60 years later, they remained baseless theories. The families of the lost have long sought recognition of their loved ones, but Flight 739 remains a ghost story of the skies that refuses to be laid to rest. Flight 649. It was just supposed to be like any other Tuesday for Lufthansa Flight 649, a routine flight from Tokyo to Frankfurt. However, in the early hours of February 22, 1972, an unexpected crisis unfolded. As the Boeing 747-200 flew through the night sky after departing Tokyo, 5 armed men suddenly stood up with their guns drawn. The plane was hijacked. Suddenly, what started out as a normal flight was now a site of terrorism as the hijackers directed the plane towards Aden in what was then South Yemen. Their demands were clear: pay a ransom of $5 million by morning, or the plane will be blown up and everyone on board would be met with a tragic end. Now, this was actually the first ever terror attack against the German national carrier, and with the clock ticking, the West German government was left with a difficult choice to make. After hours of negotiation and 172 lives hanging in the balance, the ransom was paid. As promised, the hostages were released, and the hijackers surrendered to South Yemeni authorities. And surprise, surprise, just a few days later, they were released without any charges, most likely after giving $1 million of the ransom to the authorities. Unfortunately, the result of this compromise was soon shown as the ransom money was rumored to fund new terrorist attacks, including the Lod Airport massacre, which happened just months later. Flight 401. During the last days of the year 1972, December 29th, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, crashed into the Florida Everglades while on its way to Miami International Airport, directly killing 101 of the 176 people on board. The aircraft had been on a routine flight from New York's JFK Airport to Miami. During landing, the crew noticed a glitch in the gear light that didn't confirm whether the nose gear was down. While trying to fix the issue, they accidentally turned off the autopilot. This caused the plane to slowly descend without anyone noticing. Distracted by the faulty light, they didn't realize the plane was losing altitude, and unfortunately, the aircraft crashed into the Everglades. The airlines did not release any official statement about the failure behind the flight, but a report later revealed that it was the pilot who unintentionally bumped the control yoke and turned off the autopilot. Interestingly, the crash is also known for the ghost stories reported by Eastern Airline crew members. You see, parts of the crashed plane were allegedly salvaged and installed in other aircrafts. This led to multiple reports seeing Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo on board by both passengers and crew members, even after they had both died in the crash. These ghost stories became so widespread that Eastern Airlines did eventually stop using salvaged parts from the wreckage. Flight 007. It all happened in the dawn of September 1st, 1983, when Korean Airlines Flight 007, a commercial airliner carrying 269 people, strayed off course over the North Pacific. The plane was on its final leg from New York to Seoul, after its stopover in Anchorage, Alaska. Completely unknown to the crew and passengers, they were steering dangerously close to one of the world's most secretive and heavily defended military zones: Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Cold War was at its peak, and the skies were in no man's land, high with tensions. Soviet radar picked up the unidentified aircraft, and fearing it was a US spy plane, several planes, including 2 Su-15 interceptors, were sent. Despite several attempts to make contact, the pilots received no response. Supposedly, they had trouble identifying the plane due to poor weather. In fact, the aircraft didn't just come close, but it actually entered Soviet airspace twice, which is why the Soviets were so alarmed. After that, The orders were clear: take it down. And at 6:26 a.m., a missile streaked through the sky and struck the aircraft, eventually sending a badly damaged KAL-007 plunging into the Sea of Japan. Every single person on board died. The world stood still as the news spread. How could the plane's navigation system allow the aircraft to stray off course? Was no one alerted of the plane going in the wrong direction? The aftermath was a storm of international outrage. The US condemned the act as a brutal massacre, while the Soviets, cold and calculating, claimed they had no idea it was a civilian plane, and to them, it looked like a spy vehicle. More surprisingly, in 1996, the Soviet pilot who fired the shot revealed that it was clear that the plane was a commercial aircraft, but it meant nothing to him as it could have been a military spy plane appearing as a civilian aircraft. Also, he didn't tell the ground that it looked like a Boeing aircraft, a passenger plane. When asked about this, he simply replied, "They didn't ask me." Flight 990. EgyptAir Flight 990 took off from New York on October 31st, 1999, and was headed for Cairo, Egypt. The Boeing 767 was flying smoothly, carrying 217 people. Just a nice, calm routine flight. But things took a terrifying turn when just over an hour after takeoff, at around 1:50 a.m., the plane suddenly plunged from 33,000 feet in a nosedive. The cockpit was suddenly chaotic, with alarms and confusion. The co-pilot, Mil al-Batouti, who had taken control moments before, repeatedly uttered the scary phrase, "I rely on God." The captain, shocked, fought to pull the aircraft out of its dive, but the plane continued its deadly fall. The Boeing twisted and turned for nearly 3 minutes, plummeting toward the Atlantic Ocean. Radar screens blinked frantically, and aircraft control could only watch in horror as the blip vanished from their screens. At 2 a.m., the plane crashed into the sea, leaving no survivors. After the NTSB investigators, it was established that likely the co-pilot had deliberately led the crash since he had previously been accused of inappropriate behavior. The officer, who had allegedly prohibited him from flying on any US route again, was on board. The official had previously told the co-pilot al-Batouti that this was his flight, to which al-Batouti bitterly replied, "This is the last flight for you too." However, the Egyptian authorities refused to accept the conclusion of the investigation, and instead, that the crash was due to a mechanical malfunction rather than ill intentions. While the US authorities never accepted this conclusion, they did demand a technical change to all Boeing 767s. Flight 800. On a warm summer night in 1996, Trans World Airlines Flight 800 took off from New York's Kennedy International Airport and headed for the capital of France, Paris. But 12 minutes into the flight, as it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean near Long Island, the Boeing 747 suddenly exploded, sending fiery debris flying across the night sky. The sudden yet tragic explosion claimed the lives of all 230 people on board, including 16 high school students from Pennsylvania on a class trip to Europe. Witnesses reported seeing what looked like a missile streaking toward the plane before it erupted into flames. This started a wild discussion on how Flight 800 could have become a victim of terrorism. However, the investigation that followed was, at the time, the longest and most expensive in the National Transportation Safety Board's history. After exhaustive efforts and $40 million, the cause was ultimately ruled as an electrical failure that set the plane's nearly empty center wing fuel tank on fire, and not a terrorist act. Despite the official conclusion, the mystery of this flight remains, as some remain persistent that the explosion of Flight 800 was due to an attack, or even friendly fire. Flight 522. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca International Airport, heading toward Prague's Václav Havel Airport, with a stopover in Athens. The flight was proceeding normally until it suddenly lost communication with air traffic controllers. Alarmed, the Greek military scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept the unresponsive aircraft. When the fighter pilots intercepted the plane, they made a truly shocking discovery. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot were slumped over in their seats, unconscious. The passengers in the cabin also appeared lifeless, their oxygen masks hanging limply from the ceiling. The fighter pilots could do nothing but follow as the Boeing 737 flew on autopilot until it eventually ran out of fuel and crashed into a hillside near Grammatico, killing all 121 people on board. The investigation later revealed that a maintenance error had caused the cabin pressurization system to be left in manual mode, leading to gradual loss of cabin pressure. In their disoriented state, the crew failed to recognize the emergency, mistaking the pressurization alarm for a different warning. As the cabin pressure dropped, the crew and the passengers slowly succumbed to hypoxia, a lack of oxygen. Despite the dire situation, one flight attendant, Andreas Pordomu, attempted to save the aircraft. Evidence from the cockpit voice recorder revealed that he entered the cockpit and tried to regain control of the plane. The flight data recorder showed that the autopilot was disengaged shortly before the crash, likely due to his efforts. The Greek fighter pilots also reported seeing someone moving in the cockpit, further supporting this account. Unfortunately, Pordomu's efforts came just too late. The disaster shook Cyprus and Greece, leading to significant changes in airline safety protocols, particularly concerning cabin pressurization and crew training. However, some questions remain unsolved, such as why the crew did not realize the true nature of the emergency sooner, and why Pordomu was unable to fully control the plane despite his efforts. Flight 574. On January 1st, 2007, a seemingly ordinary day turned tragic when the world witnessed the disappearance of Air Flight 574 over the Makassar Strait. The Indonesian Boeing 737, carrying 102 passengers and crew, vanished without a trace in the midst of a storm. And despite an immediate search effort, no clues were found for weeks. Finally, a real breakthrough came not until August 2007 when the flight's black boxes were retrieved from the ocean depths. The investigation soon revealed that Flight 574 had veered off course due to a malfunctioning navigation system. The pilot struggled to control the plane as the inertial reference system, a key component of the aircraft's navigation, failed to align properly. This failure, with the crew's inability to deal with the situation, caused the plane to spiral out of control. Tragically, as a result, no one survived. The crash placed Air under intense scrutiny, with serious questions arising about the airline's safety practices and possible cost-cutting measures that may have contributed to the disaster. Flight 447. On June 1st, 2009, Air France Flight 447, en route from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil to Paris, France, fell into the Atlantic Ocean, taking 228 lives. For over 2 years, the disappearance remained one of the aviation's biggest mysteries. With data recorders lost deep underwater, investigators relied on automated messages from the plane to piece together the events. These messages hinted at a technical issue with the aircraft's airspeed sensors, which was worsened by severe weather and led to a tragic chain of errors. After the black boxes were recovered in April 2011, they finally gave more answers. The cockpit erupted into chaos as the plane faced thunderstorms, iced up sensors, which ended up disengaging the autopilot. The pilot struggled with the malfunction and lost control, primarily due to misjudgments and incorrect reactions to losing vital tools. Apparently, as the plane was flying over the Atlantic when, suddenly, its airspeed sensors began showing conflicting information. After the autopilot switched off, the pilots were left to fly the plane manually. One pilot focused on keeping the plane steady, the other trying to figure out what was happening. Despite the messages flashing on their screens, they struggled to understand the issue. The pilot couldn't rely on inaccurate airspeed readings, thus resulting in incorrect control inputs. This put the plane eventually in a stall. Despite having multiple opportunities to recover, the plane plunged into the ocean. The investigation later raised fingers on pilot training and aviation safety regulations. The crash led to significant changes in pilot training programs, emphasizing manual flying skills and the proper response to unreliable airspeed situations.